Rings, Swords, and Monsters, Lecture 1. What is fantasy literature? Genre, canon, and history. And now, Professor Drout.
Fantasy literature is probably the most popular and influential genre of literature in the 20th century. Now, I know that's a fairly large claim to say something like that fantasy is more important than all the great mainstream literature and the Nobel Prize winners. But if you start to look at its influence, both throughout the 20th century and now into the 21st, in popular culture, in film, in art, and in literature, and when you look at the numbers and you see how many fantasy books sell compared to other books, and also when you look at who reads fantasy and which people read fantasy, you'll see how important it is to study this subject, which really hasn't been given as much academic study as it deserves. Fantasy, however, is somewhat difficult to define. People define it the way Potter Stewart, the Supreme Justice, used to define obscenity. He says, I'm not going to define it, but I know what it is when I see it. And that sort of is how we work with fantasy, too. We think with magic, heroes, monsters, castles, medieval settings, and quests. These are all elements of fantasy. But any one of those elements can also be found in mainstream literature. You can have monsters, you can have castles, you can have historical fiction. And so it's a little more difficult to define rigid boundaries for fantasy, and I'm not sure we're going to be able to do that. Instead, we're going to look at fantasy as a genre, as a category within literature that has kind of porous or fuzzy boundaries. And you can go from fantasy into science fiction, into historical fiction, into horror or ghost stories, and into romance, and even into mainstream literature. And you'll see that it's hard to know when you've crossed over from fantasy to something else. A good rule of thumb, though, is that fantasy is about things that could have happened but didn't, while science fiction is about things that physically can happen or haven't have happened yet. And I would say that romance is the category that then cuts across fantasy, science fiction, and historical fiction to kind of complicate things. Fantasy generally is set in an imaginary past. Science fiction is set in an imaginary future. But again, that's not 100% correct. One of the most famous science fiction films of the past 50 years starts out a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Though many people, myself included, might argue that Star Wars has a lot more to do with fantasy than it does with traditional science fiction. Fantasy is generally contrasted with realism. Those are the opposite ends of some kind of a spectrum. And this is a division that goes all the way back to Henry James and has been very influential about deciding what is serious, important, and good literature and what's just genre and fun. And I want to complicate that question a little bit by first pointing out that realism is a really problematic category. Because every time scholars have tried to look at what makes for a realistic novel versus some other kind of novel, they've been unable to find any single element that is found in realistic novels that isn't found elsewhere. And vice versa, they can't find anything that's in fantasy that doesn't show up in mainstream literature. It seems to be that if you have too much of it, then it becomes fantasy. But that's still a big problem. Linguistically, there's nothing that's used in a realistic novel that isn't also used in a fantasy novel. And so it becomes very difficult to pull them apart. Another example would be in fantasy, realistic description of things like landscape, creatures, architecture, or habits and customs. All of those things are very much follow the realistic canon, the realistic method of describing things. Realism is often said to focus on realistic or deep psychological motivation for characters. And it is true that when you look into novels by people like Faulkner, Toni Morrison, and Ernest Hemingway, there's a very strong focus on the characters' interior lives. However, you can find that focus in fantasy literature also. Some of the literature we're going to examine is not that closely focused on psychological motivations, but some of it very much is. For example, the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant by Stephen R. Donaldson, you might even say, are too focused on the character's interior life. Another way of defining or separating out fantasy from realistic literature is to say that realistic literature is focused on the minutiae of social interactions between people. And this would be the case for realistic literature being defined by things like Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice or the books of Henry James. And right there, that should tell you we have a problem, since Henry James is defining the category of realistic literature and saying that it's the only really good literature in contrast to fantasy. And of course, he's defining that to put his own books at the very center of it. So we're going to reject some of these categories, at least temporarily. And we're not going to come up with some kind of short Webster's-type definition of fantasy. Instead, what I propose is we look at a lot of works that are considered to be right smack in the middle of the fantasy genre. For example, J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, which more than any other work defines fantasy for the 20th century. We're also going to look at Ursula K. Guin's Earthsea books, Terry Brooks's many sort of Shannara books, Stephen R. Donaldson's The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. We can then expand our examination of fantasy to include things that are also in other genres but are part of fantasy. For example, children's fantasy is an incredibly important category. Some would say that the 1970s and early 80s were the golden age of children's fantasy. However, when J.K. Rowling came out with her Harry Potter books, that started a new golden age of children's fantasy. And as well as Rowling, we would look at things like The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising, Lloyd Alexander's The Chronicles of Prydain, and maybe Ursula K. Guin's Earthsea books, though they also fit into the adult genre. There are other books and older books that have fantastic elements, but aren't always considered to be part of the genre of fantasy. And these would include things like Alice in Wonderland, The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald, or The Water Babies by Charles Kingsley. These are Victorian books. They're old books, but they yet have fantastic elements to them. And they set the stage for people like Tolkien, who would define the new category that we're looking at. So, what do all these works have in common? Well, first of all, this may seem very trivial, but they're all very long. Fantasy novels generally tend to be quite long. They tend to be multiple books, 3, 5, 7. I think the only reason there's not a lot of 4s is no one knows what the proper term is. And it's not quadrology, it's tetralogy, but most people don't know that. But you have trilogy, and you have the 7 books of C.S. Lewis's Narnia cycle, and the 7 books of Rowling's Harry Potter, the 5 books of Ursula K. Guin's Earthsea, and so forth. What else do they have in them? Well, fantasy has magic. Almost all fantasy has some kind of magic or some kind of actions that contradict the laws of mundane physics. Science fiction has this too, but fantasy often doesn't explain the details as much, whereas in Star Trek they might talk about we have deuterium or we have an antimatter engine. In fantasy it's explained as we have a magic ring. We don't talk about what kind of waves or particles come shooting off the ring to manipulate people. It's enough that it's a magic ring. Fantasy also contains otherworldly creatures. Again, in science fiction, this might be aliens. In fantasy, these are creatures often from mythology, sometimes from the author's own imagination. Things like hobbits, elves, dwarves, dragons, old ones, cauldron-born, wizards, talking trees. You can go on and on. In fact, some of the joy of fantasy is seeing either what authors can do with an existing category that we would inherit, like elves or dwarves, or how creative they can be in coming up with something completely new, like the cauldron-born or the Ents, the talking trees, though Tolkien borrowed the word for that, but not the concept. However, fantastic elements, magic, and otherworldly creatures are all found in works that are not part of the fantasy genre. And these works are usually called magical realism, and they are among the most celebrated and rewarded and respected works in 20th century literature. Magical realism includes writers like Jorge Luis Borges, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Umberto Eco, Italo Calvino, Salman Rushdie, and Mark Helprin. These writers, who often have come from a Latin American tradition, though some of them are Italian and some write in English also, are among the most celebrated because of the beauty of their prose, because of the style of their writing. And this suggests one of the criticisms of fantasy, is that maybe fantasy authors are just bad writers. And if they'd written as well as Salman Rushdie or Jorge Luis Borges, then they would be magical realists. I think that's wrong, and I think, as we'll see in the final lecture, that there's something very specific to magical realism that's very different from fantasy and that makes it more palatable to realist critics. But it is important to note that everything that a great celebrated prize-winning author like Rushdie or Calvino or Eco or Garcia Marquez is doing is something that shows up in more genre category fantasy and more popular fantasy, on the kind of thing that you'd find in the supermarket checkout line. And I think it's a mistake to say, oh, well, the magical realists are dealing with important themes and the fantasy writers are just trying to sell books. First of all writers are trying to sell books. Second of all, the themes that Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and Ursula Le Guin deal with are among the most important and emotionally moving to a huge number of people. Tolkien is very concerned about the problem of death and the problem of possible immortality, as is Le Guin, though they come at it from very different angles, as is C.S. Lewis. These writers are concerned with problems of religion, they're concerned with problems of interaction between races, all of the very key issues that we're talking about today. The fact that when the Lord of the Rings movies came out, people saw them immediately as having something very important to say about the events of September 11th, 2001, and the subsequent geopolitical events, when in fact the Lord of the Rings books were written 50 years before, and the Lord of the Rings movies had all gone into production long before the events of 2001, suggests how powerful and meaningful the ideas dealt with by fantasy authors really are. Now, defenders of fantasy literature will often argue that what separates fantasy literature from, say, magical realism or mainstream literature is that fantasy has a strong ethical and moral perspective. I also reject that idea because I don't see how you can say that the magical realist writers, that someone like Salman Rushdie, someone like Mark Halperin, doesn't have an ethical perspective, doesn't have a moral perspective. In fact, interestingly enough, the political perspectives of, say, Mark Halperin, who wrote Winter's Tale, and Salman Rushdie, who wrote the Satanic Verses, are probably diametrically opposed, but they certainly do have that point of view. Defenders of fantasy say, oh no, wait, mainstream fantasy, it's pro-Christian, it's pro-tradition, it's pro-moral values. But I don't think you can possibly look at something like Haroun in the Sea of Stories by Salman Rushdie or the stories by Gabriel Garcia Marquez and say it doesn't have moral values. And I really reject the idea that you have to break this down into some kind of left-wing, right-wing political dichotomy, and that Tolkien is somehow right-wing and Rushdie is somehow left-wing. I mean, maybe in their personal politics, though if Tolkien were alive today, he would almost certainly be a member of the Green Party. So to call him super conservative is probably a mistake. But more importantly, it's not that fantasy has an ethical perspective and other types of literature don't. It's that what fantasy chooses to focus on are often transcendent themes that modernist literature has been afraid to touch. The problem of death, the problem of immortality, mainstream modern literature, and even magical realism touches that problem by talking about how does a death of one person affect lots of other people? How does knowing you're going to die affect you and your relationships with other people? Fantasy takes a much bigger perspective. What does it mean that someone is going to die and leave the world in some way? Or, as Ursula Le Guin would argue, are they going to be reincarnated and why do they resist that? Or, as Tolkien and Lewis would argue, why do people resist death when it's the entry point to paradise? These are problems that people have struggled with for centuries, but that mainstream modernistic literature has pushed to the side, and fantasy fills that void in a certain way. But I should add to this that it's a bad idea to say that fantasy does one thing and mainstream literature does another, because within fantasy there's a whole lot of differentiation. Tolkien has one approach, Le Guin has another, Donaldson has yet a third. The children's fantasists have a very different approach than, say, the writers who work in Arthurian literature, like T.H. White or Marion Zimmer Bradley. The Arthurians are building off of a long tradition of a type of fantasy that is very concerned with social interaction, with relationships between men and women, with relationships between kings and servants and friends. And so those particular people working in fantasy have a very different approach than, say, Tolkien or Stephen Donaldson or Robert Holdstock, who's coming from an entirely different tradition. We also might want to look at how the readers of fantasy react to fantasy. And that might tell us something about what is fantasy and what's not. Instead of saying, did an author intend for something to be fantasy? Because I think clearly that Garcia Marquez does not consider himself to be part of the same genre as J.R.R. Tolkien and Ursula Le Guin. But instead of saying, does the author want to be part of this genre, we could say, do readers perceive it as being part of the same genre? Now, that would immediately suggest to us that one of the ways to define fantasy is by popularity. One publisher said fairly recently, fantasy is mass market, everything else is niche. And if you go into your bookstore, you'll notice a gigantic fantasy section, often marked out very specifically with pictures of dragons and damsels in distress and monsters and castles. But you'll also note that right in the middle of the adult books and right in the heart of the bestseller list are the Harry Potter books, which really can't be any other genre besides fantasy. Despite their elements of school story and everything else, they're truly fantasy. You'll note that new fantasy works come on the market all the time and shoot their way up the bestseller list, that fantasy authors who churn out book after book, like Terry Brooks, who we will discuss, sell to millions of people. But even more, that those readers of fantasy can still differentiate between good fantasy and bad fantasy, the same way we differentiate between good mainstream literature and bad mainstream literature, the same way we differentiate between the really excellent works of a mainstream author like, say, John Irving, and the more mediocre secondary works that sell but yet are not seen as being as successful. And even very highbrow authors like John Updike or Toni Morrison have good books and bad books. So it shouldn't be a surprise to us that there's good books and bad books within fantasy. What we'll do in this course is examine mostly what I think is the best fantasy to come out in the past 50 years, and also talking about some of the older materials that leads in. We'll have a very strong focus on J.R.R. Tolkien, because Tolkien is the father figure, if you were, that all subsequent fantasy has to deal with. They either have to react against him or imitate him or try to escape from his shadow in some way. We're also going to look at the ways that some mass market fantasy may transcend its category, may reach the point where it can be both a bestseller and an important work of art, and not simply because it's a part of popular culture or because it's influenced a lot of people, but because as a literary artifact, it's done something that hasn't been done before. I would argue that Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea books, and Robert Holdstock's Mythago Wood and Lavandis, at least, have reached a position in 20th century literature where they deserve to be taken just as seriously as many of the other important mainstream texts that come along. Perhaps fantasy literature is not only a new invention of the 20th century, despite the fact that we're going to connect it to the 19th, it really is invented in the 20th century. But perhaps, as many people think, fantasy is the rebirth or the reanimation of something that is very old and something that came before. And what I'm talking about here is epic and traditional oral epic, in fact. And that brings us all the way back to texts like Beowulf, The Song of Roland, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, texts that we have as written copies, but texts that reflect very clearly a pre-existing oral tradition. And I want to take a little time here to talk about what that means, because people throw around the term oral tradition without really thinking clearly how it works. Now, oral tradition started to be studied seriously in the 1930s, when two Harvard researchers, Milman Parry and Albert Lord, went off to the former Yugoslavia and began collecting, using that new technology of recording, collecting oral folk tales. And what they noticed in the Muslim parts of Yugoslavia in particular is there was a tradition during Ramadan of the men of the village going to a coffee house and listening to long epic tales that were sung by people called guslari. And the guslari were called that because they played an instrument called the gusla, which is a one-stringed instrument played with a bow. And I have to say, as much as I've tried to be a good sport and enjoy the music, it sounds like a cat being strangled. But nevertheless, the guslari would sing these enormously long epic tales. Now, Parry and Lord became particularly interested in these because they noticed that they were done in a form very much like hexameters. Those are 6 meters in a line, which is what the works of Homer, the Odyssey and the Iliad, were done in. And so Parry and Lord started to possibly see a connection between Homer and these living oral traditions, and they started to record them. And they learned some really amazing things. The first was that even though these things were 3,000, 4,000 lines long, they were never the same from one performance to the other. So it was clear that the singers had not memorized the giant long epic poems that they were producing. And studying these singers and asking them what they were doing and seeing how they worked led to what's called the theory of oral composition. Now what this means is that these singers have memorized a bunch of formulae so that they can fill out a line. They've got some type scenes. They've got a general story. But then they make up the story each time. And they make it up because they've listened to other people sing these stories for their whole lives. And most of the singers are quite old. They've listened through their whole growing up process of sitting in these coffee houses at night during Ramadan and listening to these men tell these stories. And they built up more and more and more stories. Well, Parry and Lord realized that some of the characteristics in these stories were very much like those in Homer and those in other classical materials that were supposed to be written. Then when they compared them to things like Beowulf, they also found similarities. And what this showed was that there was an existing oral tradition going around through various cultures that only got written down very, very late. If you think about it, for the vast majority of human history, humans were illiterate, so they couldn't write down their epic tales. But they could pass them on in something like this form of oral composition. And it also showed that instead of trying to expect someone to memorize a 3,000-line poem, they could memorize a set of techniques that could make them generate a 3,000-line poem. Now, if you're skeptical of this idea and how it might connect to fantasy, you can see exactly how this process worked, because in the 1960s, after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, a Yugoslavian epic singer made up a poem called A Death in Dallas. And he had read newspaper articles about the Kennedy assassination, but he cast it as a traditional Serbo-Croatian oral epic poem, and it's been recorded and it still exists. Now, my point in bringing this all up is that's very much how someone like J.R.R. Tolkien worked, not necessarily in the oral tradition, but in the same process of taking material and building it into a very, very large epic format. The other important point is perhaps the reason that fantasy is so popular is it taps into this deep cultural root of an oral tradition that we've always had in our culture, but which was supplanted really in the Victorian period, maybe you can say even in the 18th century, but it was supplanted by the novel. Before then, all storytelling was oral storytelling. Even if people read stories, they read them aloud. And it's only with the advent of cheap books in the Victorian period that more and more people start to write. The quote, hordes of scribbling women that came out in the Victorian period who invented the novel really as much as any male writers did. Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters and many, many lesser writers also. What happened then for a couple hundred years, or maybe 150 years, is the novel, the written novel, took over from oral tradition, and novels can do things that oral traditions can't do. Novels are really good about deep psychological motivation. They're very good about minute description of human interaction, but they weren't particularly good at the epic sweep of things. Yes, you have Sir Walter Scott and you have the Victorian adventure novels, but they were still following the canons of realism. So when Tolkien finally came along and started writing his fantasies, really even before World War I started, he was reaching back and tapping into this long, long, long tradition. And it's my belief that fantasy fulfills the same function in our society that the oral tradition used to fulfill. It allows us to interact with very difficult questions. It provides models and references and type scenes and formulae that we can use to communicate ideas very effectively. And it does so in a way that is easily reproduced the way oral tradition was. You can tell the story of The Lord of the Rings a lot easier than you can tell the story of Portrait of a Lady, because the two novels are trying to do very, very different things. Now, I would not go so far as to say that Tolkien is oral tradition. He sat there and wrote with a pen. We have the actual manuscripts. And he uses all the techniques that his predecessors had invented. Not just the predecessors everybody focuses on in medieval times, the Beowulf poet and the author of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Chaucer and so forth, and not just the Victorian writers that he was so clearly influenced by, but also the 20th century writers like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf who were inventing new techniques. Fantasy uses all the things that modern literary technology, if you'll let me say something like that, has come up with. Flashbacks, unreliable narrators, stream of consciousness, interlace, wordplay, complex, exquisitely timed plots, the kind of things you can't do in oral tradition, but you can sit there like Tolkien did and figure out the phases of the moon for every day of your story so you can figure out what which character was seeing when they're in two different places and play them off against each other and make them parallel and create different kinds of suspense. Fantasy writers use all of that. They use the technology of the printed book. They use maps. Fantasy's famous for having maps in the books, whereas a lot of other texts do not. So all of these things are mixed with the power of the traditional epic to create something that's even better and more powerful. And that's my main argument about fantasy, is that fantasy does all the stuff that mainstream literature does, but it tries to do other things as well. Fantasy tries to get us to think about our place in the universe, to think about our place in nature, to think about our place in the world in a way that mainstream fantasy can't do, because mainstream fantasy is so tied to the world. Mainstream fantasy can't get outside the real world to look in on it and comment on it the way fantasy does. So I think you'll see In the next lectures, as we work through the history of fantasy, as we then work through J.R.R. Tolkien's contributions, and then the writers who followed Tolkien, what I think you'll see is that fantasy is deserving of as much respect as any mainstream literature. And more importantly, that even more than mainstream literature, it repays close study with an additional reward of understanding more about the way the human heart works. In the next lecture, we're going to trace the roots of modern fantasy, starting with the ancient epics, but not paying that much attention to them, paying much more attention to the roots of fantasy in the Victorian era, and looking at some of the books such as Alice in Wonderland, George MacDonald's The Princess and the Goblin, and Charles Kingsley's The Water Babies that set the stage for what would follow.